Hello there. Good evening. You're watching the press preview. It's the first look at what are on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines. That's with Moya Lothian-McLean, contributing editor at Novara Media, and Annabel Denham, director of communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs. They're going to be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what is on some of those front pages. This will hurt. That is the front of the Metro after the big Bank of England rates rise and the expectation of a long recession to come. Similar sentiments in the Express, which says there are stormy times, ahead. The Eye describes what's to come as a toxic shock for millions of people and the country's economy as a whole. As the Times tells us, the rise is aimed at heading off the worrying increase in inflation we've been seeing in recent months. And the Financial Times says that despite the latest rise, the bank doesn't think the future rises will be as high as the markets has feared. And as the Chancellor wrangles with how to balance the books, the Telegraph says that he's planning a raid on capital gains to raise the money for the Treasury's coffers. The Manchester Evening News leads with the highly critical report from the inquiry into how emergency services handled the 2017 Manchester Arena bomb attack with the headline, "Never Again." The Guardian leads with the angry reaction of families whose loved ones might have survived the attack if they hadn't been failed at every stage. The Mail asks simply, what on earth has happened to our 999 services? And the Mirror focuses on one young victim of the attack, that's 8-year-old Safi Rose Roussos, and quotes her dad as saying she fought for her life but was badly let down. While the Sun leads with the departure of the England footballers' wives and girlfriends on a luxury yacht heading for the World Cup in Qatar. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out all of the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discussing them. Well, tonight we're joined by Moya Lothian-McLean, contributing editor at Novara Media, and Annabel Denham, director of communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Very good evening to both of you, ladies. Thank you for joining us here on Sky News. Not a lot of joy on the front pages, it's fair to be said, isn't it, on those front pages. Let's talk about the front of the Metro. The simple headline, "This will hurt." Bank warns of longest recession ever with biggest rate rise in 33 years. Moya, starting with you, it's pretty stark, isn't it?
Yeah, it is indeed. I mean, the headline sort of sums it up. They're warning at the moment that we're facing a 2-year recession and that it's meant to be going on longer because of the recent sell-off of government assets. They think the downturn won't be quite as deep as perhaps in 2008, 2009, but for the millions of people who will be impacted by this, particularly starkly the 10% of poorest households, the Resolution Foundation said today, are going to be particularly impacted. This is not good news. And the rising interest rate hike means that more than 5 million households will probably see mortgage repayments next year increase by nearly £4,000. So house prices in the last few years have been astronomical, but borrowing costs have been low. But now they are no longer at those low rates. People are saddled with huge amounts of debt they just simply cannot afford to repay.
There are a lot of difficult choices, aren't there, that are going to have to be made by the new Chancellor and Prime Minister, Annabel, and they've not got long, have they, before the next big fiscal event on the 17th?
No, I mean, I think we're in for an extended period of misery. And what struck me about that Metro headline was the use of the word will. Let's not forget that a lot of people are already feeling immense amounts of pain, struggling to pay their energy bills, despite the energy price guarantee, finding that food prices have increased to such a degree that they're struggling to afford their supermarket trolleys. So this will hurt, but it's already hurting already. We are really in for a long period of difficulty. And I think, the political implications of this are really significant, because Rishi Sunak may not actually preside over any growth in the UK economy over the entire course of his premiership. And unlike so many prime ministers, he cannot blame what has come before, because for the last 2 years, until his resignation earlier this year, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. We are, a very long way from that predicted post-COVID economic boom, the V-shaped recovery that we were all hoping for in the deepest, darkest depths of lockdown. It certainly is not the case that UK GDP is going to be past pre-pandemic levels by 2025. Far from it. And I think, a lot of questions will now be asked about how we found ourselves in this situation. Blame will, of course, be placed on our response to the coronavirus pandemic and also the war in Ukraine. But I don't think that we should forget that there have been structural problems with our economy for many, many years now. We've had stagnant growth, stagnant productivity. We have a tax burden that is the highest it's been in 7 decades. This increasing growth of the state, even if Liz Truss is no longer our Prime Minister, she was right that successive governments had presided over managed decline. And that is something that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt are going to have to tackle, along with all of the other economic headwinds we're now facing.
All right, and you're saying there that Liz Truss was right about some things, but coming to you on this, Moya, if it weren't for the disastrous mini-budget, we wouldn't be having to have this next big fiscal event with undoing everything that she put in train.
Exactly. Liz Truss tipped what was a problem into a full-blown crisis, and now they're having to mop up the mess that was left. But what is interesting about this is there's competing ideas about exactly what needs to be done in order to fix the UK economy. For example, yesterday, Larry Elliott, the Guardian economics editor, said that this black hole, this fiscal black hole that keeps being talked about, is essentially a fairy tale, and warned that the Conservatives are actually going to repeat the mistakes of austerity in 2010. In 2008, there was warnings that raising interest rates would cause a monster recession. But then in 2010, George Osborne decided it was time to tackle this so-called budget deficit to keep the financial markets happy. And what we have seen over the last few weeks in particular is that anything at any cost is about keeping the financial markets happy. But this often comes at the expense of the actual public, who've been subject for the last 10 years to tax increases and spending cuts, which have brought the country's public services to breaking point. And now we look set to do it all again for this fiscal black hole that is being talked about over and over.
Let's talk, Annabelle, about the FT. Bank of England takes dovish stance despite biggest rate rise for 30 years. I mean, when you listen to what Andrew Bailey had to say, it didn't sound particularly dovish to me. What did you hear in it that was dovish?
No, not much that was dovish at all. But of course, this is in contrast to actions taken by the US Federal Reserve and the warnings from Jay Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, that interest rates over in the US are going to peak at a level higher than was expected. And what we're seeing here on UK soil is a standoff between the Bank of England and other institutions and investors over the terminal rate, essentially how high interest rates are going to go. And the bank has today pushed back against market expectations that interest rates could hit 5.25% next year. The bank has, and Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England, has said that they can't make promises over future interest rates, but he thinks that based on where we are today, the bank rate will go up by less than is currently priced in financial markets. Now, I mean, I think this probably has to be taken with a slight pinch of salt, because the Bank of England, the Monetary Policy Committee, have been very wrong on inflation over the last couple of years. And indeed, has the US Federal Reserve. Both institutions have called it transitory, and were calling it transitory for really far too long, long after it had become apparent that inflation was going to be a very real concern for many months and years to come. So yes, the Bank of England might be more dovish than the Fed, but it has nonetheless brought in this 0.75 percentage point rise. It is the largest for 3 decades. And I think it's probably the right amount. It's bringing us in line with the Fed and the European Central Bank. And the question really now is how much higher interest rates are going to go, not just here, but in the US as well.
And Moya, just very quickly, a final word from you on the economy. Do you see any silver linings?
No, but I do see an opportunity for us to really examine our current economic setup. If we're having, 3 recessions over the span of 12 years, surely the current system is not working as it's intended to, and something else should be considered.
Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me now are Moya Lothian-McLean, contributing editor at Novara Media, and Annabel Denham, Director of Communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs. We're going to switch gear now to talk about the inquiry that's been taking place into the dreadful events that took place in Manchester Arena, and a stark reminder on the front page of the Manchester Evening News, Moya, that these families have waited more than 5 years to hear the conclusions, to hear that their relatives were badly let down at every stage.
Yes, indeed. The story that follows this front page is extremely powerful. It's written it opens with the words of Safi Rose Roussos, which is, "Am I going to die?" Which it was reported later in the aftermath, and it came out in this report that this is what she said. An 8-year-old child said after going to this concert to see her favorite singer, Ariana Grande, and instead the slow responses of emergency services, this inquiry found, meant that 2 people who could have lived, there was a remote possibility that Safi could have lived, and that John Atkinson, who was a 28-year-old care worker, had survivable injuries. That both of these people could have been saved, was it not for a series of failures in all branches of the emergency services that were deployed that night. So this inquiry has taken, as you say, 5 years in the making. It's been extremely traumatic for families who've had to both relive the pain of losing loved ones, but also the push for answers. Within this story, then Safi's family talk about again and again and again being pushed back, denials from Greater Manchester Police, being told that no, nothing went wrong, that they weren't at fault, etc. And now this inquiry, they say, vindicates something that they knew all along, that there were deep systemic failures within the response of emergency services that meant where people could have got help, they didn't.
Yeah, and the question is, I suppose, Annabel, whether these mistakes can ever happen again. And certainly the parents of Safi Rose are continuing to insist that she would have lived had those errors not been made.
Yes, I mean, that's right. And, on the cover of the Mail, which I know we'll be talking about later, it appears that some of the mistakes that were made after the Manchester terrorist attack were actually made after the 7/7 bombings. So this isn't really a case of, these were in unprecedented circumstances. Emergency services perhaps haven't been tested to this extent before, but we now know mistakes were made and we will learn from them because this has happened in the past and the mistakes have been repeated. And there are so many avoidable errors that appear to have been made. The fact that nobody declared a major incident